A senior clerk at Buckingham Palace noticed on Monday morning that a specific new institutional designation had been added to the palace's internal directory over the previous weekend. The designation was Counselor of the Realm. The clerk had never seen the designation before. She checked the archive references, she checked the historical records, and she confirmed within an hour that the specific designation had never existed inside the palace's records at any previous point. The clerk did not comment. She only noted the designation in her weekly summary and continued her duties. She had worked at Buckingham for 28 years, and she had never once seen an entirely new institutional designation appear inside the palace's directory without a specific written announcement. King Charles had asked the family to gather at Buckingham Palace on Tuesday afternoon. The invitation had been hand-delivered by a single trusted aide to each family member separately. It said only that Charles wished to speak formally about his sister, the Princess Royal, in a way he had never spoken publicly about any member of his family across the whole of his reign, and that Charles would, at the same afternoon, formally bestow on Anne a specific new royal honor that had never before existed within the palace's records. The specific nature of the honor had not been revealed in the invitation. Neither had the specific nature of what Charles would say, but every member of the family understood, from the moment they received the specific invitation, that Tuesday afternoon would carry something Charles had never permitted himself to say aloud before. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The family arrived at Buckingham on Tuesday afternoon in the specific order Charles had requested. William and Catherine arrived first. Sophie had been present since morning, as trusted witness. Camilla had been asked to attend and had accepted immediately, and Anne arrived last, at Charles's specific request. The Princess Royal had, in her characteristic way, not asked what the gathering would carry. She had only accepted the invitation, prepared herself for the gathering with her usual quiet discipline, and arrived at the front entrance of Buckingham Palace at exactly the specific hour Charles had asked her to arrive. Anne had, on entering the specific drawing room where the family had gathered, immediately understood that whatever the afternoon would carry, it had been prepared with the specific care that Charles brought only to the most significant family moments. The room had been arranged carefully. The specific chairs had been placed in a specific formation Anne recognized as a formal small gathering, and the specific atmosphere in the room carried a weight Anne had, in fact, been quietly holding at arm's length since Charles's brief private conversation with her 2 weeks earlier. A formal family bestowal, in plain words, is a specific ceremonial moment in which a member of the royal family receives a new title, order, or institutional designation from the sovereign, delivered in a small private setting before any public announcement is made. This one had been prepared by Charles personally over the previous 3 months, in careful consultation with William, Catherine, and Sophie. It had been discussed with Anne only briefly, in a specific private conversation 2 weeks earlier, in which Charles had told his sister only that he wished to make a specific formal recognition of her lifetime of service to the family. Anne had, at that specific conversation, tried to dissuade Charles from anything ceremonial. Charles had gently refused to be dissuaded. The specific new institutional designation Charles had prepared to bestow on Anne was Counselor of the Realm. A Counselor of the Realm, in plain words, is a specific new institutional role that Charles had created within the palace's records, giving the person holding it formal authority over specific matters of family continuity, institutional memory, and household coordination that had, until this specific afternoon, been shared informally across several members of the wider household. The role had been drafted over the previous 9 months, quietly, by a small circle of palace advisors working with William personally on the specific institutional wording. It carried specific formal authority. It carried specific ceremonial privileges. And it recognized, in the specific institutional shape it took, the specific work Anne had done quietly and without recognition across her whole adult life. Catherine had known about the specific bestowal for 6 months. The princess had, in fact, contributed to the drafting of the specific role's wording, drawing on her own decade of institutional work to help shape the specific responsibilities Anne would formally carry. Catherine had, from the earliest draft, understood exactly what Charles was trying to build, and she had known from the same earliest moment that Anne would resist any specific ceremonial recognition, and that Anne's resistance was itself the specific reason the recognition needed to be made. William had known about the specific bestowal for 8 months. The prince had, in fact, been the one who first raised the specific idea with his father over a private lunch at Windsor. William had noticed, throughout the previous years of the transition, how consistently Anne had been the family's quiet stabilizer. He had noticed how often she had been present at the specific moments that mattered most. He had noticed how consistently she had been the one who drew the practical shape of every institutional development. And William had, at that private lunch at Windsor, told his father that the family had, for a very long time, taken Anne for granted in ways that no one had ever properly named. Charles had listened, and Charles had, from that specific lunch forward, begun to think about how the specific recognition could take specific institutional shape. Camilla had known about the bestowal for 3 months. The Queen Consort had, in fact, been quietly supportive from the moment William had raised it with her. Camilla had watched Anne throughout her own time in the family, with the specific respect that only another woman who had entered the family from outside could fully bring to Anne's specific lifetime of service. Camilla had, from the moment she had learned of the specific plan, offered to help in any specific way she could. And she had, over the previous 3 months, helped Charles refine the specific ceremonial elements of the afternoon's small gathering. Sophie had known about the bestowal for the longest of anyone outside Charles himself. The trusted confidant had been part of the specific working group from the earliest drafting, in a coordinating role. Sophie had also known, from the specific way Anne had accepted Charles's brief private conversation 2 weeks earlier, that Anne herself understood what was coming and had chosen, with characteristic dignity, not to protest against it further. The 4 reactions moved through the drawing room in a slow, spreading current. Charles felt weight first, then quiet resolve, then the specific peace of a monarch who had, at last, prepared the specific formal recognition his sister had never asked for, but had, in his private assessment, earned across a lifetime of quiet service. William felt honor first, then love, then the calm relief of a nephew who had, at last, watched his father give Anne the specific recognition William himself had raised 8 months earlier. Catherine felt tenderness first, then love, then the same steady care she always carried when the family stood at an important edge. Anne felt something specific arrive in her that she had, in fact, been quietly trying to hold at arm's length since Charles's brief conversation 2 weeks earlier. It was not pride, it was not embarrassment. It was, more precisely, the specific quiet recognition that she had at last been seen. But the story behind Charles's specific decision was longer than any one Tuesday afternoon, and to understand what Charles was about to say and what Anne was about to receive, the story had to move backward. This did not begin with a Tuesday gathering. It began nearly 7 decades earlier, in the specific years of Anne's own childhood, when a young princess had watched her older brother, the future king, take his own first steps into the specific weight of royal duty, and had, from those specific earliest years, quietly begun to carry a specific parallel weight of her own. Anne had been, from her earliest years, the specific kind of royal child who understood duty before she understood the words that named it. She had watched her mother, Queen Elizabeth II, carry the specific weight of the crown across her whole youth. She had watched her father, Prince Philip, carry the specific weight of consort service alongside his wife, and Anne had, from her earliest years, quietly begun to develop her own specific relationship to duty, a relationship that did not seek attention, did not seek recognition, and did not seek any specific ceremonial acknowledgement. Anne had, throughout her adult life, become the specific kind of working royal who did more than almost anyone in the family without ever asking anyone to notice. She had, across many decades, carried the largest number of individual patronages of any working royal in the country. She had, across many years, undertaken the largest number of individual engagements of any working royal in the country, and she had done so, consistently and without complaint, across specific years when the family's public work had been difficult, across specific years when the family's own difficulties had been intense, and across specific years when other members of the family had been unable, for their own reasons, to carry the specific weight the crown required. Anne had also, quietly, become the specific member of the family that other members of the family relied on when the specific institutional weight of a family moment required someone who would carry it steadily without needing to be recognized for carrying it. According to a documented account later prepared for senior aides, Anne had, across her adult life, been present at more difficult family moments than any other member of the family other than Elizabeth II herself. She had been present at moments the country would never know about. She had been present at moments that had shaped the specific institutional continuity of the crown in ways no public account had ever fully described, and she had, in each of those specific moments, held the specific practical shape steadily, without any recognition, and without any specific request for it. Charles had noticed this his whole life. The king had, in fact, watched his sister carry the specific weight of family stabilizer from the specific years of their own childhood together. He had noticed, throughout their shared youth, how consistently Anne had been the one who kept the specific practical rhythm of the family steady, while others, Charles included, had struggled with the specific difficulty of their own respective duties. He had noticed, throughout their adult lives, how consistently Anne had been the one who arrived at the specific family moments without any announcement, carried the specific weight of those moments without any acknowledgement, and departed the specific family moments without any specific request for thanks. Charles had, throughout his adult life, felt a specific quiet debt to his sister that he had, until 8 months earlier, not known how to acknowledge properly. William had first raised the specific question with Charles at a private lunch at Windsor 8 months earlier. The prince had, over the previous years of the transition, noticed the same specific pattern his father had noticed his whole life. William had watched Anne draw the practical shape of the transition steadily, across every specific institutional development, without ever asking for any specific credit. He had watched her review the drafting of the family privacy protocol, the sovereign preparation framework, the working monarchy framework, and every other specific institutional development the family had built together across the previous years. And William had, at that private lunch at Windsor, told his father directly that the family had, for a very long time, taken Anne for granted in ways that had never been properly named. Charles had listened to William carefully. The king had, from William's specific words at that private lunch, understood something specific he had not fully understood before. He had understood that the specific quiet debt he had felt toward his sister his whole life was, in fact, a debt the entire family had accumulated together. He had understood that Anne herself would never raise the specific matter or ask for the specific acknowledgement. And he had understood, from William's specific words, that the responsibility of naming the debt now belonged to Charles himself in his specific role as sovereign. Charles had, from that private lunch forward, begun to think carefully about how the specific recognition could take specific institutional shape. He had considered several specific options. He had considered a specific existing order or decoration. He had considered a specific ceremonial title. He had considered a specific new patronage arrangement. And he had, at last, decided that none of the specific existing options carried the specific institutional weight Anne's specific service deserved. Charles had, over the following 3 months, begun to draft the specific new institutional designation, with the working group William had assembled to help him dot, according to a private palace briefing prepared for the senior household in the months of the specific drafting. Charles had approached the working group with 3 specific requirements. First, the specific designation must carry genuine institutional authority, not merely ceremonial recognition. Second, the specific designation must recognize the specific quality of what Anne had done, the quiet stabilizing across every specific family moment, rather than the specific quantity of her individual patronages or engagements. And third, The specific designation must be structured so that Anne could not, in her characteristic way, refuse or diminish the specific recognition without appearing to refuse or diminish the family itself. The working group had drafted the specific designation across 9 months of careful work. They had considered the specific institutional authorities the role should carry. They had considered the specific ceremonial privileges. They had considered the specific relationship the role would carry to the existing structure of the household. And they had, at last, arrived at the specific institutional shape Charles would bestow on Anne on Tuesday afternoon. Anne herself had been given the specific brief conversation with Charles 2 weeks before the Tuesday gathering. Charles had told her only that he wished to make a specific formal recognition of her lifetime of service. He had not described the specific designation. He had not described the specific ceremony. He had only asked whether Anne would accept the specific recognition when it was offered. Anne had, at that specific conversation, immediately tried to dissuade Charles. She had said that any specific recognition should go to William or Catherine, both of whom carried more difficult daily responsibilities than she did. She had said that any specific recognition of her own work would embarrass her, and she had said most characteristically that she had only done what her family had always expected her to do, and that no specific recognition was required. Charles had gently refused all 3 of Anne's dissuasions. He had told his sister that the specific recognition was not about her comfort. It was about the specific institutional truth the family had for far too long allowed to go unnamed. He had told her that the specific designation carried practical institutional authority the family genuinely needed her to hold going forward, not just ceremonial recognition of what she had done. And he had told her, most importantly, that the specific decision to make the bestowal was Charles's own, as sovereign, and that Anne's characteristic humility could not, this specific time, be permitted to override it. Anne had listened. She had thought about Charles's specific answer for a long moment, and she had at last accepted the specific recognition without any further attempt to dissuade him. That was why the story had reached this specific Tuesday afternoon. Not because any single event had forced the timing, not because any single anniversary had triggered it, but because a specific quiet debt the family had accumulated across 7 decades had, at last, arrived at the specific institutional shape it needed to take. And once Anne had accepted Charles's specific brief conversation 2 weeks earlier, the story had no choice but to return to the present. Charles stood up from his chair at the small round table where the family had gathered. The king did not raise his voice. He did not adjust his coat. Charles only looked at his sister for a long moment across the drawing room, then looked at William, at Catherine, at Camilla, at Sophie, and at last returned his gaze to Anne. And then Charles began to speak. A formal family address, in plain words, is a specific short speech given by a member of the royal family to their close family, delivered in a small private setting without any staff involvement, that carries the specific weight of the individual's own personal words, rather than the specific weight of any prepared institutional statement. Charles had prepared his address across the previous 3 months. He had rehearsed the specific wording quietly, alone, in his private study at Highgrove. He had considered every specific sentence carefully, and now, standing in the small drawing room at Buckingham on Tuesday afternoon, Charles delivered the specific address he had prepared. Charles spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He did not read from any notes. He did not raise his voice. Charles simply looked at Anne across the drawing room and spoke, in the specific personal way he had rarely permitted himself to speak about any member of his family across the whole of his reign, about what his sister had been to him personally and to the family across a lifetime of quiet service. He described the specific memories of their shared childhood, the specific moments in the years of their youth when Anne had been the specific person who kept the practical rhythm of the family steady, while Charles himself had struggled with the specific difficulty of his own preparation for the crown. He described the specific years of their adult lives, the specific difficult family moments when Anne had been present without any announcement, and had carried the specific weight of those moments without any recognition. He described the specific decades of Anne's own working service, the specific quiet stabilizing across every specific institutional development the family had built. And he described, most personally, the specific debt that he had, in fact, been quietly carrying toward his sister his whole life. Then Charles delivered the line that would carry through the rest of the afternoon. His voice did not tremble. His words did not stretch. Charles said simply, "I have watched Anne carry this family for 50 years." The words were short. The words were exact. And the words landed in the drawing room with a weight no signature could match. Charles had not defended the specific bestowal he was about to make. He had not praised his sister's specific accomplishments beyond what he had already described. He had only named the specific truth that had, in fact, been true for the whole of his reign and for the whole of his sister's adult life. Anne had carried the family, steadily, quietly, without any specific request for recognition, for 50 years. Charles then stepped forward, walked slowly across the drawing room to where Anne was sitting, and formally bestowed on his sister the specific institutional designation the working group had drafted. He handed her a specific document that carried Charles's own signature at the bottom. He handed her a specific small ceremonial pin that the palace's craftsman had prepared over the previous month, in a specific new design that Charles had commissioned personally. And he stated formally, in the specific words the working group had drafted, that Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, was from that moment the family's first counselor of the realm. Anne received the specific document with both hands. She received the specific ceremonial pin the same way, and Anne did not immediately speak. The Princess Royal had, in fact, prepared herself for this specific moment across the previous 2 weeks and had thought carefully about what she would say when the specific bestowal was made. But sitting in the small drawing room at Buckingham, holding the specific document Charles had signed and the specific pin the palace's craftsman had made, Anne understood that no specific prepared wording would land quite right. Anne stood up from her chair. The Princess Royal did not raise her voice. She did not adjust her clothing. Anne only looked at Charles for a long moment across the drawing room, then looked at William, at Catherine, at Camilla, at Sophie, and at last returned her gaze to Charles. And then Anne delivered the response that would carry through the rest of the afternoon. Her voice did not tremble. Her words did not stretch. Anne said simply, "The family has always been the honor." The words were short, the words were exact, and the words landed in the drawing room with a specific weight that only Anne's characteristic understatement could have carried. Anne had not defended her own service. She had not diminished Charles's specific bestowal. She had only named the specific truth that had, in fact, guided her whole adult life. The family itself had been the specific honor. The specific institutional designation Charles had bestowed on her was only the specific formal name for what the family had already been to her, quietly, for 50 years. Charles received Anne's specific response carefully. The king did not respond immediately. He only looked at his sister for a long moment, then walked slowly back across the drawing room to his chair and sat down. Charles did not speak again for several minutes. He only sat quietly, holding the specific quiet peace of a monarch who had, at last, given his sister the specific recognition she had earned across a lifetime. William stepped forward next. The prince did not speak. He only walked slowly across the drawing room, embraced Anne briefly, and returned to his seat beside Catherine. Catherine did the same. Camilla did the same. Sophie stepped forward last, embraced Anne quietly, and returned to her position against the wall. Anne felt clarity first, then quiet gratitude, then the same disciplined care she had brought to every private moment in the family for her whole life. Charles felt certainty first, then quiet peace, then the deep gratitude of a monarch who had at last named a specific institutional truth the family had lived with for far too long. William felt honor first, then love, then the calm relief of a nephew who had, at last, watched his aunt receive the specific recognition she had earned. Catherine felt tenderness first, then love, then the same steady care she always carried when the family stood at an important edge. Charles delivered the timing last. The king did not raise his voice. Charles said only that the palace's formal announcement of the specific bestowal would go out the following morning, that the specific ceremonial pin Anne had received would be worn at all future formal royal occasions, and that the specific institutional authority carried by the specific designation would take effect immediately. Anne did not object. She only nodded once quietly and thanked her brother formally for the specific bestowal. Anne drove back to her private residence at Gatcombe Park that Tuesday evening. The Princess Royal did not travel with any specific ceremonial escort. She only drove herself, as she had for most of her adult life, along the specific familiar roads that had carried her home so many evenings after so many days of service. She held the specific document Charles had signed in her lap for the whole journey. She did not open it again. She only held it steady, quietly, as the countryside slipped past the windows in the evening light. A private return home, in plain words, is a small, quiet passage between a public or family moment and the space where a member of the royal family can, at last, absorb what has happened without any observer present. Anne had, over her many decades of service, developed her own version of the practice, a specific quiet drive home along familiar roads, without any staff and without any specific ceremony, so that she could absorb the specific weight of a difficult or emotional day before returning to her ordinary life. This one would be no different. Except that this one would be the longest quiet return home Anne had ever driven. Anne arrived at Gatcombe at approximately 9 o'clock. She entered her private residence through the specific back entrance she always used, hung up her coat, placed the specific document Charles had signed on the small table in her hallway, and walked into her private sitting room. She sat down in her usual chair. She did not turn on any lights beyond a single small lamp near the window, and Anne sat, alone, for almost an hour, in the specific quiet of her own home, absorbing the specific weight of the afternoon fully. According to a later documented account prepared for senior aides, Anne wrote a short private note during that specific hour, in her own hand, that she placed inside her own personal drawer without showing it to anyone. The specific note has never been described publicly. No member of the family has, at any stage, been shown its contents. But Anne's personal secretary would, some years later, note that the Princess Royal had kept the specific document Charles had signed in the specific top drawer of her private desk, alongside a small handful of specific personal papers Anne had held most closely across her lifetime, and that the specific note Anne had written on that specific Tuesday evening had been placed alongside them. Catherine visited Gatcombe the following morning. The princess had, in fact, offered to visit the previous evening, but Anne had gently declined, saying that she wished to have a specific quiet evening alone first. Catherine had understood immediately. She had arrived at Gatcombe on Wednesday morning, bringing only a small hand-arranged bouquet from her own private garden at Kensington, without any specific formal greeting or specific ceremonial acknowledgement. Anne received the specific bouquet with quiet gratitude. She placed it in a small vase on the small table beside her chair, where it would remain for the specific week that followed. Catherine did not stay long. The princess had understood from her specific reading of Anne's characteristic dignity that any extended visit would begin to embarrass Anne in the specific way Anne had always resisted being embarrassed. Catherine only sat with Anne for a short while, drank a cup of tea, and told Anne quietly that the specific bestowal had, in her assessment, done exactly what William had raised it to do 8 months earlier. It had named a specific institutional truth the family had lived with for far too long, and it had done so in the specific way that only Charles, as sovereign, could have done it. Anne received Catherine's words carefully. She only nodded once, quietly, and thanked Catherine for making the visit. William visited Gatcombe on Wednesday afternoon. The prince did not stay long either. William had understood, in the specific way only a nephew who had watched his aunt for his whole life could have understood, that Anne would receive any extended visit with the same specific characteristic dignity that had shaped her whole adult life. William only sat with Anne for a short while, walked with her briefly around the small garden behind her residence, and thanked her quietly for the specific decades of quiet service she had never asked to be thanked for. Anne received William's words the same way she had received Catherine's. She only nodded once, quietly, and thanked William for making the visit. Charles visited Gatcombe on Thursday morning. The king did not travel with any specific ceremonial escort. He only drove down himself in a specific private car, along the specific familiar roads that he and Anne had, in fact, driven together many times across their shared lifetime. He arrived at Gatcombe at approximately 10 o'clock. He sat with his sister in her private sitting room for almost 2 hours, and Charles told Anne, in the specific personal way that only a brother could tell a sister, all the specific memories from their shared childhood that he had not been able to describe fully in Tuesday afternoon's formal address. Anne listened. She did not interrupt, and at the end of the specific 2 hours, Anne only thanked her brother for coming, walked him back to his specific private car, and stood at the specific back entrance of her residence as Charles drove away. Camilla visited Gatcombe on Friday afternoon, quietly and without any specific announcement. The Queen Consort did not stay long either. She only sat with Anne for a short while, and told her that the specific bestowal had, in her assessment, been the specific institutional gesture the family had needed for a very long time. Anne received Camilla's words carefully. She did not respond aloud. She only nodded once, quietly, and thanked Camilla for making the specific visit. Sophie visited Gatcombe on Saturday morning. The trusted confidant did not come to lecture. She only came to sit quietly with Anne, drink a cup of tea, and tell Anne that no member of the family, herself included, would ever forget the specific way Anne had received the specific bestowal on Tuesday afternoon. Anne accepted Sophie's specific words the same way she had accepted every other visit. She only nodded once, quietly, and thanked Sophie for coming. By the end of the specific week, Anne had received all 5 specific visits, one from each specific member of the family who had been present at Tuesday afternoon's small gathering. Each visit had been short, each visit had been quiet, and each visit had, in its own specific way, delivered a specific personal acknowledgement that no formal ceremony could have delivered. Anne had received them all with the same characteristic dignity that had shaped her whole adult life. The palace released its formal announcement of the specific bestowal on Wednesday morning. The wording was brief, the tone was steady, and the signature at the bottom belonged to the king. The announcement confirmed only 3 things. King Charles had, on Tuesday afternoon, formally bestowed on his sister, the Princess Royal, a specific new institutional designation created within the palace's records. The specific designation, Counselor of the Realm, carried specific formal authority over specific matters of family continuity, institutional memory, and household coordination, and the specific bestowal had been made in recognition of Princess Anne's specific lifetime of quiet service to the family and to the crown. A palace announcement of this kind, in plain words, is a short official statement issued by the palace to make an institutional decision clearly known to the country at a specific hour. This one mattered because it was the first time in modern history that a reigning monarch had formally created an entirely new institutional designation for a specific member of the wider family, and because the specific designation had been created specifically to name a specific institutional truth about Anne's decades of service. The country did not receive the announcement with alarm. The country received it with quiet warmth. Most viewers had, in fact, been quietly aware for many years of how consistently Anne had carried her working responsibilities across every specific family moment. Most had noticed her specific presence at every specific difficult occasion. Most understood without needing to be told directly that the specific bestowal had named an institutional truth that had, for far too long, gone unnamed. And most received the specific announcement with the specific satisfaction of watching a specific overdue recognition at last be made. A major newspaper carried the story under one careful headline that spread across every screen by midday. The family's quiet strength was always Anne. A national newspaper headline, in plain words, is the short, bold sentence at the top of a story that shapes how the public will read everything below it. This one mattered because it named the specific institutional truth in the shortest possible way, and because the specific verb was captured exactly what had always been true, and what had, at last, been formally named. A national broadcaster framed the whole moment with one line during a midday bulletin. A national bulletin, in plain words, is a short news update read out at fixed times of day, meant to give the whole country the same version of the story at the same moment. The broadcaster said only this: "The king has, at last, named what the country has quietly known for decades." That sentence traveled quickly. It did not carry alarm. It only named what the palace had confirmed. Anne did not appear publicly on the day of the announcement. The Princess Royal remained inside Gatcombe, quietly, and the palace made no attempt to explain her absence beyond the specific note that had already been released. That silence, too, was a decision. It allowed Anne to carry her own specific moment privately, in a way that a scheduled appearance would have made impossible. William made a brief public statement from the front of Kensington Palace on Wednesday afternoon. The prince did not read from any notes. He only paused briefly, looked steadily at the small selected press gathering that had been quietly assembled, and offered a single short sentence. "My father named what my whole life has known." The prince said nothing else. He only turned quietly, walked back inside the palace with Catherine beside him, and closed the door softly behind them. Charles felt certainty first, then quiet peace, then the deep gratitude of a monarch who had, at last, given his sister the specific recognition the family had owed her for 50 years. Anne felt clarity first, then quiet gratitude, then the same disciplined care she had brought to every private moment of her whole life. William felt honor first, then love, then the calm relief of a nephew who had, at last, watched his aunt receive the specific institutional truth she had earned. Catherine felt tenderness first, then love, then the same steady care she always carried when the family stood at an important edge. By evening, a second broadcaster framed the story with the line that would carry the longest. This was not a new honor. This was an old truth at last, permitted to be named. That sentence traveled further than the first. It did not exalt anyone. It did not diminish anyone. It only named what had happened, in language the country could carry home. And inside the palace, the household understood that the story had passed beyond their reach. The public had received the announcement, and no further explanation would be needed. Charles signed one final document 3 days later. The king did not summon a large audience. Charles simply sat inside his private study, read the wording twice, and signed. The paper confirmed the formal institutional shape of the new designation, and set out the specific practical authorities the Counselor of the Realm would carry going forward. A private palace protocol, in plain words, is an internal royal rule that controls how sensitive family matters are handled behind palace doors. This one mattered because it formalized the specific institutional shape of an entirely new role, so that its specific authorities could carry forward across future generations without requiring a fresh designation each time. The protocol confirmed that the Counselor of the Realm would carry formal authority over specific matters of family continuity, institutional memory, and household coordination. It confirmed that the specific designation could be held by any member of the wider royal family whom the reigning sovereign chose to designate, and that the designation would remain with Anne for as long as she wished to hold it. and it confirmed that any future bestowal of the designation would require the specific written agreement of the reigning sovereign, the Prince of Wales, and the Princess Royal, together. Anne signed her own copy the same afternoon. William signed as the third witness, and the protocol was placed formally within the palace's institutional records the same evening. Camilla signed a personal acknowledgement. The Queen Consort had not been asked to countersign the protocol itself, but Camilla had, of her own initiative, written a short handwritten note welcoming the specific formal shape of the new designation and asking that her acknowledgement be placed within the archive alongside the founding document. Anne received the note with quiet gratitude. She placed it inside her own personal drawer, alongside the small handful of specific personal papers she had held most closely across her lifetime. Sophie carried the finalized protocol to the office of the Lord Chamberlain later that evening. The trusted confidant did not speak as she delivered it. Sophie only handed the sealed folder to a senior aide and left without waiting. She had done her part, and she would not need to do it again. William offered the final judgment inside a quiet corridor at Buckingham Palace. The prince spoke to Charles with the plain, steady tone that had carried the whole story. William told his father that a specific institutional truth that had gone unnamed across 50 years had at last been named, and a truth named across the family's institutional record was a truth that would outlive every person currently in the family, and would carry into a future the family could not yet imagine. Charles nodded. The monarch understood the message. The story reached its final truth inside those words. A family can survive a lifetime of quiet service. A family cannot survive a lifetime of quiet service that no one has, at last, been permitted to name. The monarchy did not weaken that week. The monarchy only demonstrated again that its most institutionally weighted acknowledgments carried their weight best when the family had prepared them privately and named them publicly at the right moment. King Charles had broken his silence about a specific member of his family. Princess Anne had received a specific royal honor that changed everything the family had for 50 years refused to say aloud. But William had raised the specific question first. Catherine had helped shape the specific institutional wording. Camilla had helped refine the specific ceremonial elements. And Anne, at last, had received the specific institutional name for what she had, quietly and without any specific request, been for the whole of her adult life. King Charles had broken his silence. Princess Anne had received her royal honor. And behind the 4 minutes of a specific formal address in a small drawing room at Buckingham Palace, 50 years of quiet family stabilizing had at last been permitted to carry its own specific institutional name. If this story moved you, please take one moment to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of the royal family's most private struggles. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.